31 years after two sisters vanished near a desert radio tower, a dying woman drew a map on a napkin. The call came to Detective Reyes on a Tuesday afternoon, a day so ordinary it felt wrong. The voice on the phone belonged to a hospice nurse, her tone professionally calm but with an undercurrent of urgency that decades of police work had taught Reyes to recognize. A patient was asking for him. Not just any police officer, but him specifically. She said the patient, a woman named Beth, had a story to tell about the Harper girls. Reyes felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his stomach. The Harper girls, Lily and Anna. The case was a ghost that had haunted his department, and him personally, since 1991. It was one of the first big cases he'd worked as a young detective. A sprawling, fruitless search that had ended with nothing but unanswered questions and a family torn apart by grief. He had thought about it more times than he could count, running the sparse facts over and over in his mind, looking for a thread he might have missed. Now, after all this time, a thread had appeared, thin and frayed, from the one place he never would have looked, a deathbed. He drove to the hospice with a sense of dread and a flicker of something he hadn't felt about this case in a long time yet. Fragile, dangerous hope. The building smelled of antiseptic and quiet resignation. Beth's room was at the end of a long, silent hallway. Inside, the world was reduced to the soft beep of a monitor and the weak sunlight filtering through drawn blinds. Beth was a whisper of a person, lost in a sea of white sheets, her skin as thin and pale as old paper. Her eyes, however, were wide and alert, burning with a feverish light that had nothing to do with her illness. It was fear, a fear that was 31 years old. The nurse left them alone, closing the door with a soft click. For a long moment, there was only the sound of Beth's labored breathing. Reyes pulled a chair to her bedside. He kept his voice low and gentle, the way he would with a frightened witness. He introduced himself, but she just nodded, as if she already knew everything about him. Her gaze kept darting to the door, then back to his face. She seemed to be gathering the last of her strength. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dry rustle of leaves. She said she was there that day, in the desert, with Lily and Anna. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy with unspoken history. Reyes leaned forward, his professional skepticism warring with the cold certainty that this was real. He had heard countless confessions over the years, many of them false, born of guilt or a desire for attention. But this felt different. This felt like a wound being torn open. Beth's hand trembled as she reached for a glass of water, and Reyes helped her take a small sip. She told him about the heat, the endless blue sky, the way the radio tower looked like a giant metal skeleton on the horizon. They were just kids, she said. They weren't supposed to be out that far, but it was an adventure, an escape from the boredom of a long summer. They were playing near the base of the tower, daring each other to touch the rusted metal fence that surrounded it. And then they heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it was clear. It was their mom, she said. Lily and Anna's mother. The voice was calling their names. Lily, Anna, come here, girls. Mama's here. Beth's breath hitched, a dry sob catching in her throat. But it couldn't have been their mother, she whispered. Mrs. Harper was miles away, back in town. Beth knew that. She had seen her go to the market that morning. A cold chill that had nothing to do with the air-conditioned room washed over Reyes. He remembered the detail from the original file. The mother had a rock-solid alibi. She had been distraught, convinced her girls had been taken, but she had been nowhere near that tower. Beth said she was scared. She told Lily it was a trick, maybe a radio playing. But Lily, the older, braver one, just smiled. She said it was Mom. Maybe she had come to surprise them. Anna, who always followed her big sister, took Lily's hand. They started walking toward the tower, toward the voice. They called out, "Mom, we're coming!" Beth just stood there, frozen. The voice came again, closer this time, seeming to echo from the very base of the tower itself. It sounded so real, so warm, so full of love. But something was wrong. There was a strange quality to it, a flatness, like a recording. She screamed for them to come back, but they didn't listen. They slipped through a gap in the fence and ran toward a small dark doorway at the tower's base. They disappeared inside, and the voice stopped. The silence that followed, Beth said, was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. She waited. She called their names until her throat was raw, but they never came out. So she ran. She ran all the way home and never told a soul what she had seen. The guilt, she whispered, had been a poison inside her ever since. Her story finished. Beth seemed to shrink further into the bed, exhausted by the effort. But she wasn't done. With a shaking hand, she reached under her pillow and pulled out two objects. One was a folded napkin, grime-stained and softened with age. The other was a single, heavily rusted key. She pushed them into Reyes's hand. Her fingers were cold. He unfolded the napkin. On it, drawn in a shaky, fading pen, was a crude map of the radio tower. An arrow pointed to a spot near the base, with an X marking the ground. Beside the X were three words, written in a desperate, spidery script. Sublevel B, do not open. Reyes stared at the map, then at the key. It was old, thick, and looked almost military grade. Where had a little girl gotten a key like this? Beth's eyes were closing now, the burning light finally starting to fade. She whispered one last thing, her voice barely audible. It sounded so much like her, she said. It sounded just like their mom. Back at his desk, under the flat, humming lights of the precinct, the key and the napkin felt like artifacts from another world. The key was heavy in his palm, its rust flaking off onto his skin. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It was industrial, the kind of key that opened something meant to stay closed. The map was even more unsettling. The drawing was childlike in its simplicity, but the words were filled with an adult's dread. Do not open. Why would a child write that? What had she seen or heard that would make her warn someone away from the place her friends had just entered? Reyes pulled the original case file for Lily and Anna Harper. It was thick with dust and brittle with age, a cardboard tombstone for two lost girls. He opened it, and the smell of old paper filled his small office. The faces of Lily and Anna stared up at him from faded photographs. Lily, 8 years old, with a gap-toothed, confident smile. Anna, 6, clutching a small plastic horse, her eyes wide and serious, half hidden behind her bangs. He remembered their parents, the Harpers. He remembered the press conferences, the pleas for information. He remembered the mother, a fierce, hollowed-out woman who refused to believe her daughters had simply wandered off. She insisted, over and over, that someone had taken them. She spoke of a feeling, a mother's intuition, that something evil had found them that day in the desert. The father had been the opposite. A quiet, broken man who seemed to crumble inward with each passing day. He'd lost his job, started drinking. The strain had shattered their marriage a few years after the girls disappeared. He had died of a heart attack in 2005, a man consumed by grief. The official theory, the one that had closed the case, was exposure. 2 little girls, lost in the vast, unforgiving New Mexico desert. The search had been one of the largest in the state's history. Hundreds of volunteers, police on horseback, helicopters scanning the endless expanse of sand and rock. They had searched for weeks, finding nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single sign of where the girls had gone. It was as if the desert had simply swallowed them whole. Reyes flipped through the reports, his eyes scanning the familiar details. He found the section on the radio tower. It was noted as a decommissioned Air Force communications relay, abandoned since the late 1980s. The report stated that the structure and the immediate surrounding area had been searched. A small concrete building at its base contained only junk and debris. The door was unlocked, hanging on one hinge. There was no mention of a sublevel, no mention of a locked hatch. How could they have missed it? Was it possible it was so well hidden? Or was Beth's memory, clouded by time and trauma, creating things that weren't there? He ran his finger over the crude drawing of the tower on the napkin. The X was precise, not just near the tower, but at a specific corner. He felt a growing unease, a sense of something being terribly wrong. Beth's story, as wild as it sounded, was starting to fit into the empty spaces of the old investigation. The complete lack of evidence, the way the girls had vanished without a trace from an open area. A lure, a trap, something that would make two smart little girls walk willingly into danger. The voice of their mother. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. He kept digging through the file, looking for anything that might corroborate Beth's story about the voice. And then, he found it. Tucked into the back of the folder was a thin sheet of paper, a supplemental note written by a rookie patrolman who had been part of the initial canvassing team. The note was brief, almost an afterthought. It detailed interviews with a few ranchers who lived miles from the tower. They had mentioned hearing strange things from that direction for years. Distorted radio broadcasts, odd noises on the wind. One of them had even used the word voices. The note had been dismissed by the lead detective at the time, labeled as local superstition and unsubstantiated rumor. In 1991, with no other evidence, it must have seemed like nonsense. But now, paired with Beth's confession, it felt like a vital, overlooked clue, a ghost of a warning that no one had listened to. He looked from the rookie's note to the rusty key on his desk. The two pieces of a 31-year-old puzzle sitting right in front of him. He knew then that he had no choice. He had to go back to that tower. He had to see if the X on the map led to a dead end, or to the end of a nightmare. Reyes didn't tell his captain where he was going. Not yet. He didn't want the bureaucracy, the red tape. This felt personal. He called two people he trusted. Detective Miller, a younger, sharper cop who had a healthy dose of skepticism but always had his back, and Dr. Aris Thorne, a forensic anthropologist from the university who owed him a favor. He told them only that he was following up on a new lead in an old cold case. He didn't mention the deathbed confession or the map drawn on a napkin. He knew how it would sound. When they met him at the edge of the city limits, Miller eyed the shovels and pry bars in the back of Reyes's truck. He asked what they were expecting to dig for. Reyes just said, answers. The drive out was quiet. The city gave way to suburbs, then to sparse ranch houses, and finally to nothing but the highway, a black ribbon cutting through a sea of pale sand and scrub brush. The New Mexico sky was a vast, empty blue, pressing down on the landscape. The heat shimmered off the asphalt, making the world look wavy and unreal. After an hour, he turned off the main road onto a dirt track that was barely visible. The truck bounced and jostled over rocks and ruts. Miller held onto the dashboard, looking out at the featureless terrain. He asked if Reyes was sure about this. This was a lot of nothing to be driving into. Reyes didn't answer. He just kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. And then, they saw it. At first, it was just a thin needle against the sky, almost invisible in the heat haze. As they got closer, it resolved into a skeletal frame of rusted steel, a lonely, forgotten monument to a dead era. The radio tower. It looked exactly as he remembered it from 31 years ago, only more decayed, more surrendered to the elements. It was a place that time had forgotten, and he wondered how many secrets it had kept in its long, silent vigil over the desert. He parked the truck a few hundred yards away, the engines ticking the only sound in the profound silence. The air outside was like a blast furnace. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all noise. There were no birds, no insects, just the faint whisper of the wind moving through the dry brush. They got out, the crunch of their boots on the gravel sounding unnervingly loud. Thorne, the anthropologist, looked at the tower with a clinical eye. Miller looked around as if expecting someone to jump out from behind a cactus. Reyes felt a strange sense of reverence, of stepping onto sacred, or perhaps profane, ground. He pulled the napkin from his pocket. The paper was soft and fragile in his hand. He oriented himself with the base of the tower, just as the drawing showed. He walked to the northeast corner, his eyes scanning the ground. It looked exactly like the rest of the desert, a patch of sun-baked dirt, scattered rocks, and thorny creosote bushes. There was nothing there, absolutely nothing. Miller came up behind him. He said it looked like a wild goose chase. Maybe the old woman was confused. Maybe her memory was playing tricks on her. It had been over 30 years. Thorne was more patient. walking the perimeter, his gaze methodical. Reyes felt a surge of doubt. The hope that had flickered to life in the hospice room was starting to die in the oppressive desert heat. What if Miller was right? What if this was just a delusion, the final, desperate act of a guilty conscience? He looked at the X on the map, then at the empty ground. He had come all this way. He couldn't turn back now. He got down on his hands and knees, ignoring the sharp rocks and the hot sand. He started brushing the dirt away with his bare hands, the way he'd seen archaeologists do on television. Miller sighed, the sound loud in the stillness. He told Reyes they should just call it in, let a proper team handle it if he was so sure. But Reyes ignored him. He kept digging, his fingers scraping against the hard, dry earth. Dust and sand caked his hands. And then he felt it. His fingertips brushed against something hard, flat, and cold. Colder than the dirt around it. It was metal. He scraped away more dirt, his movements becoming frantic. The outline began to appear, a straight, rusted edge. He looked up at Miller, his face grim. He said, "Get the shovels." The sound of shovels striking metal rang out in the empty desert, a sharp, rhythmic clang that felt like an intrusion. Miller and Reyes dug with a new urgency, while Thorne watched, his expression unreadable. Slowly, painstakingly, they cleared the dirt and rock away. The object buried beneath the sand was a large, square plate of steel, at least 4 feet by 4 feet. It was thick, dark with rust, and fused to the ground by decades of exposure. A hatch. It was exactly where Beth's map said it would be. Miller let out a low whistle. He said he'd be damned. It was real. The hatch was sealed tight. There was a large recessed handle in the center, but it was frozen solid with corrosion. They tried to pull it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it were welded shut. Reyes felt a surge of frustration. They were so close. He knelt down, examining the edges of the hatch, looking for a weak point, and then he remembered the key. He pulled it from his pocket. The keyhole on the main locking mechanism was a large, circular opening, clearly designed for a different kind of tool. The key Beth had given him was a standard, if old, pin tumbler key. It wouldn't work. His heart sank. Had Beth given him the wrong key? Or was this another dead end? Thorne, who had been quietly inspecting the hatch, called him over. He pointed to a spot near the hinge, almost completely obscured by a thick crust of rust and hardened mud. There, tucked away, was a second keyhole, a small, conventional one. It was so well hidden that anyone giving the hatch a quick glance would have missed it entirely. Reyes' hand was shaking slightly as he inserted the key. It slid in with a gritty scraping sound. He turned it. For a moment, nothing happened. He put more pressure on it, turning it as far as it would go. There was a loud, solid clunk that seemed to come from deep within the mechanism. An internal bolt had retracted. The hatch was unlocked. But it was still sealed by its own immense weight and the rust that bound it to its frame. Miller grabbed a crowbar from the truck. He wedged the tip into the seam and put his full weight on it. The metal groaned in protest, a low, screeching sound that set Reyes' teeth on edge. It was the sound of something being disturbed after a long, long time. Thorne joined in, adding his weight. The screeching grew louder, more high-pitched. With a sudden, explosive bang that echoed across the desert, the seal broke. The hatch lifted a few inches, releasing a puff of dust and a wave of air from below. They all recoiled. The air that rushed out of the opening was cold, shockingly cold compared to the blistering heat of the desert, and it carried a smell. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed for generations. A smell of damp concrete, of decay, of stale, unmoving air, and something else. Beneath the dust and the mildew, there was another scent. It was faint, organic, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. The smell of old sorrows. They crowded around the opening, peering down into the darkness. The hatch revealed a square black hole, a wound in the earth. A narrow steel ladder was bolted to one side, its rungs descending into a darkness so complete it felt solid. Reyes grabbed a high-powered flashlight from the truck. He pointed its beam into the hole, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the blackness. It didn't illuminate a bottom, it just ended. Miller shined his own light down, and for a second, their combined beams caught a glimpse of a concrete floor, maybe 15 or 20 feet below. Thorne said quietly, "Whatever is down there, it's been waiting a long time." The smell grew stronger now, a character in the room, a presence. It was a smell that promised answers no one wanted to hear. Reyes knew he had to be the first one down. It was his case, his ghost to confront. He clipped the flashlight to his belt, checked the pistol on his hip out of pure instinct, and swung his legs over the edge of the opening. The rungs of the ladder were cold and gritty beneath his hands. Miller stood over the hatch, his face tense, holding a second flashlight pointed down to light the way. "Anything happens, you yell," he said, his voice tight. Reyes just nodded and began his descent. The air changed with every rung he climbed down. The oppressive desert heat vanished, replaced by a tomb-like cold that seeped into his bones. The stale, musty smell intensified, catching in the back of his throat. It was the smell of a forgotten cellar, of wet earth and slow decay. His boots finally touched solid ground with a soft thud. He unclipped his flashlight and swept its beam around him. He was standing on a small concrete landing, no bigger than a closet. In front of him was a single heavy steel door, like something you would see on a battleship or in a bank vault. The paint was peeling, but he could still make out the faint, stenciled letters. Sublevel B. The words from the napkin. The place Beth had drawn with a trembling hand. A wave of adrenaline and dread washed over him. This was it. The point of no return. The door wasn't locked. The handle was a large, unpainted steel wheel. He gripped it with both hands and turned. It resisted, stiff with decades of disuse. He put his shoulder into it and pushed, using his full weight. With a low groaning protest of rusted hinges, the door swung inward, opening into a darkness even more profound than the access shaft. He stepped across the threshold, his light cutting a sharp white cone through the black. The beam landed on a wall of bare, poured concrete, stained with streaks of dampness. He swept the light across the room. It was small, no more than 15 feet square. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling by a wire, its glass long since shattered. The scene was frozen, a perfect tableau of abandonment. Against the far wall were 2 metal cots, their frames brown with rust. The thin mattresses on them had rotted away, leaving behind stained, tattered canvas and exposed springs. A small metal table lay on its side, one of its legs bent at an unnatural angle. Scraps of what looked like old army blankets were scattered on the floor, so decayed they were little more than piles of fiber and dust. It was a crude, Spartan space, a fallout shelter, maybe. A place built for survival. But it didn't feel like a place of safety. It felt like a cage. He took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on something on the floor. He pointed the light down. It was a small plastic toy, a horse, white, with a faded pink saddle, just like the one Anna Harper was holding in the photograph from the case file. His blood ran cold. He was standing in their grave. He forced himself to breathe, to be a cop, to be methodical. He continued to sweep the light around the small, suffocating room. The concrete walls were bare, empty. And then his light washed over the wall behind the cots. He stopped. His breath caught in his chest. Scratched into the grimy surface of the concrete was a drawing. It was a crude, childish etching, the kind of thing a kid would doodle in a notebook. 3 stick figures, 2 small ones holding hands, and a taller one standing beside them. The lines were uneven, gouged into the wall with a sharp rock or a piece of metal, and beneath the drawing, in the same desperate, scratching script, were 3 small words. A sentence that twisted everything he thought he knew into a knot of pure horror. "Mom is here," the words seemed to scream from the wall. A silent, 31-year-old cry. It wasn't a statement of comfort, it was a statement of fact. A confirmation of the lie that had lured them down into the dark. Miller and Thorne came down the ladder a few minutes later, their faces grim in the stark light of their flashlights. The small room felt crowded. the air thick with the unspoken horror of what they were seeing. Thorne, the anthropologist, went immediately into professional mode, his voice calm and measured as he began to assess the scene. It was a coping mechanism, Reyes knew, a way to put distance between the man and the tragedy. "Don't touch anything," Thorne said, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete box. "The air in here has been stable for decades. Everything is a potential source of evidence." He began a slow, methodical survey of the room, documenting the location of every object with a small camera. The overturned table, the decayed blankets, the little plastic horse that Reyes couldn't take his eyes off of. Miller stood by the door, his jaw tight. He looked at the drawing on the wall, at the childishly scrawled words, and shook his head slowly. "A monster," he whispered. "Whoever did this was a monster." Reyes felt a cold, hard anger solidifying in his chest. The grief would come later. Right now, he needed to be a detective. He needed to find out who this monster was. Thorne directed them to the cots. He knelt down, his flashlight beam playing over the space beneath them. "Here," he said, his voice quiet. Partially hidden by the rotting canvas of a mattress and a pile of dusty fibers was a small mound. As Thorne's light moved over it, the shape became sickeningly clear. Bones. Small, delicate bones, tangled together in a way that suggested they had lain undisturbed for a very long time. There was another, similar mound under the second cot. 2 small skeletons, Lily and Anna. The search was over. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the sound of their own breathing seemed too loud, too alive for this place. Reyes felt the full weight of the 31 years of not knowing, of the parents' unending agony, of Beth's silent guilt. It all settled here, in this cold, dark room, a place built to withstand a war, but used instead to hide an unspeakable crime. They worked for hours, the sterile glow of their portable forensic lights replacing the frantic beams of their flashlights. Thorne documented everything with meticulous care. He found a few other small items scattered in the dust. A single child sneaker, its laces long since rotted away. And near the first cot, half buried in the grime, something that glinted in the light. Reyes picked it up carefully with a gloved hand. It was a silver locket, tarnished almost black with age. He gently pried it open. It was empty. The picture it once held was gone. Thorne turned his attention back to the grim discovery under the cots, his examination slow and respectful. He confirmed what they already knew. The skeletal remains were consistent with 2 children, female, approximately 6 and 8 years of age. There were no obvious signs of trauma on the bones he could see, but he said he wouldn't know for sure until he could examine them properly in his lab. As Thorne continued his work, Miller kept scanning the room, as if trying to memorize every detail. His light passed over the corner behind the overturned table, a spot they had only glanced at before. He stopped. "Hey Reyes," he said, his voice low. "Take a look at this." Reyes walked over. Tucked into the corner, almost completely hidden by the bent leg of the cot, and covered in a thick layer of dust, was a dark green metal box. It was about the size of a shoebox, with heavy-duty latches on the front. It was an old military-issue equipment case. It didn't belong here, not with children's toys and rusted cots. It felt alien, an object from a different, more sinister story, a story of what had really happened in this room. With Thorne's permission, Reyes carefully lifted the box. It was heavy. He placed it on the floor in the center of the room and, with a screwdriver from their kit, pried open the rusted latches. They popped open with a sharp crack. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in decaying, yellowed foam, was a piece of electronic equipment. It was a complex array of wires, vacuum tubes, and dials, with a vintage microphone attached by a coiled cord. It looked like some kind of old radio transmitter, but it was unlike anything Reyes had ever seen before. It was a machine that had been left in a tomb with 2 dead children. And he had a terrible feeling he knew what it was for. Reyes took a picture of the device with his phone and sent it to a contact he had at the Department of Defense, a historian who specialized in Cold War-era technology. He knew it was a long shot, but the military look of the case and the vintage components felt specific. While they waited, he stood there in the silent bunker, staring at the machine. The story was starting to come together in the most hideous way imaginable. The voices the ranchers had heard. Beth's terrifying memory of hearing Mrs. Harper calling for her daughters. She sounded just like Mom. This machine, it had to be connected. An hour later, his phone buzzed, the sound shockingly modern in the ancient silence of the bunker. It was his contact, from the DOD. He had an answer. Reyes put the phone on speaker so Miller and Thorne could hear. The historian's voice was crisp and academic. He identified the device immediately. He said it was a BVS unit. A broadcast voice scrambler. It was a piece of psychological operations equipment, developed in the late 1960s. Its purpose was terrifyingly simple. It could record a person's voice, analyze the unique frequencies and tones, and then, using a series of filters and oscillators, it could replicate that voice with stunning accuracy. More than that, it was paired with a directional, shortwave transmitter. You could make it sound like the replicated voice was coming from anywhere you wanted within a 100-yard radius. From behind a tree, from inside a building, from the bottom of a dark hole. It was designed for deep cover operations, the historian explained. Imagine you capture an enemy soldier. You record his voice, then use the BVS to broadcast a call for help, luring his comrades into an ambush. It was brutally effective, pure psychological warfare. A heavy silence fell over the small room. The three men looked from the phone to the green metal box. The historian continued. The technology was clunky, and the units were rare. They were only ever issued to specialized personnel at key listening posts and communications hubs, highly controlled. You wouldn't just find one of these lying around. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying finality. Someone at the tower, someone with access to this machine, had used it as a weapon. They had likely recorded Mrs. Harper's voice at some point, maybe from a distance in town, and then broadcast it from the bunker to lure Lily and Anna to their deaths. It wasn't just a murder. It was a trap, meticulously crafted and executed with a cruelty that was almost impossible to comprehend. The image of the two little girls hearing their mother's voice, their faces lighting up with excitement and relief, running eagerly toward the dark doorway, was almost too much to bear. They had walked into their own grave, led by the one voice in the world they had been taught to trust. The historian added one more chilling detail before he hung up. Those things were notoriously finicky, he said. The voice replication was never 100% perfect. There was always a slight distortion, a kind of flat metallic quality to it. Beth's words echoed in Reyes's mind. There was a strange quality to it, like a recording. She had known. The 7-year-old girl had sensed the trick, even when her friends had not. That small detail, that flicker of wrongness, was what had saved her life. Miller swore under his breath, a long, quiet stream of curses. Thorne just stood silently, his face a mask of stone. The who was still a mystery, but the how was now sickeningly clear. They had the weapon. Now they needed to find the soldier who had wielded it. Reyes made a call to the state police archives. He asked them to pull every record they had on the old Air Force station. He wanted a list of every single person who had ever been stationed at that tower. He didn't care how long it took. He would wait. He knew the name of a monster was on that list, and he was not leaving the desert without it. Late that night, an email arrived. It was a digitized PDF of the station's personnel roster from its years of operation. The list was long, dozens of names, ranks, and service dates. Reyes and Miller scanned it line by line, their eyes sore in the glow of the laptop screen. They cross-referenced the names with the dates of service, looking for anyone stationed there in the years leading up to the girl's disappearance in 1991. And then they found him. Sergeant Thomas Miller, an audio-electronics specialist. Exactly the kind of person who would have been trained to use the BVS unit. But it was the note next to his name that made Reyes's blood turn to ice. It was a record of a disciplinary action, dated October 1990, less than a year before Lily and Anna vanished. The reason for the action: unauthorized use and modification of sensitive communications equipment. Next to it, another entry. Discharged from service. Honorable. Section 8. A psychological discharge. Sergeant Miller had been kicked out for playing with the equipment. He was a ghost, a man disciplined and discharged into civilian life. A man who likely held a grudge, a man who knew the tower and its secrets better than anyone, a man who had been in the area and then had seemingly vanished. They had a name. The name was a start, but it felt like a dead end. Sergeant Thomas Miller was a ghost. They ran his name through every database they had. DMV, IRS, Social Security, credit agencies, nothing. No activity after his discharge in 1990. It was as if he had walked out of the Air Force and stepped off the face of the planet. The frustration was a physical thing, a sour taste in Reyes's mouth. To be so close, to have the name, the weapon, the victims, but to have the killer be a phantom, was a special kind of hell. He felt he owed it to Beth, to Lily and Anna, to find him. But where do you look for a man who doesn't exist? He decided he needed to do one more thing. He needed to talk to Beth again. He had to know if she had seen anything else that day. Any small detail she might have buried or forgotten. He drove back to the hospice. The desolate landscape of the desert still burned into his mind. He found Beth weaker than before, her breath shallow, her eyes cloudy. The nurse warned him not to stay long. He sat by her bed, the room silent except for the rhythmic puffing of an oxygen machine. He spoke softly, gently. He told her that she was right, that everything she said was true. He told her they had found the hidden room. He didn't give her the gruesome details. He didn't tell her about the bones. He just told her they had found the girls. He wanted her to know that her confession, her map, had meant something, that it had finally brought them home. A single tear tracked a path through the wrinkles on Beth's cheek. The terror that had lived in her eyes for 31 years seemed to dissolve, replaced by a profound and weary sadness. She had carried this burden alone for so long, and now it was lifted. The relief seemed to take the last of her strength. She looked at Reyes, her gaze locking with his. She said there was one more thing. A detail she had pushed so far down she had almost convinced herself it was a dream. She said that as she was running away, after Lily and Anna had gone inside the tower, she had dared to look back over her shoulder. Just for a second. She saw a man. He was standing in the shadows of the doorway, at the base of the tower, the one the girls had just entered. He was just a silhouette against the darkness within. She couldn't see his face, couldn't make out any features, but he was tall, and he was wearing some kind of uniform, an olive green color, like a soldier. He just stood there, she whispered. He watched the girls go in, and then he watched her. He watched her turn and run. The image was so vivid, so terrifying. It had been the centerpiece of her nightmares for decades. The silent man in the doorway. Reyes leaned closer, his heart pounding. Did he do anything, Beth? Did he say anything? Beth shook her head slowly, the movement barely perceptible. He didn't move a muscle, she said. He just watched me, a silent observer to the horror he had set in motion. Her breathing grew fainter, the pauses between breaths longer. She looked at Reyes, her eyes unfocused, looking at a memory only she could see. Her lips moved, forming one last sentence, her voice a thread of sound, almost too quiet to hear. He waved at me, she whispered, and then her eyes closed, and she was gone. The man in the doorway hadn't just watched her escape, he had acknowledged it. A small, simple gesture, a goodbye, a taunt, a final, cruel twist of the knife. Reyes sat there for a long time, the beep of the heart monitor now replaced by a flat, continuous tone. The only other witness was gone, and the killer was still a ghost. Beth passed away that night, taking her nightmares with her. Her secret was finally out, but the justice she might have hoped for felt as distant as ever. The case was no longer a cold file about missing persons. It was an active homicide investigation. But the suspect was a name with no face, and the man's trail had gone cold over 3 decades ago. Reyes felt like he was running in place. He had answers, Horrible answers, but no resolution. There was one last duty he had to perform, the one he had been dreading the most. He had to notify the next of kin. He had to tell Lily and Anna's mother. He found her living in a small, tidy apartment in a quiet part of the city. Eleanor Harper was in her late 60s now, a woman whose face was a roadmap of her grief. The fierce, angry energy Reyes remembered from 30 years ago had been worn away, leaving behind a quiet, fragile resignation. But when she saw him at her door, a flicker of the old fire returned to her eyes. She knew who he was. She knew that a detective showing up unannounced after all this time could only mean one thing. He sat with her in her small living room, surrounded by photographs. Pictures of the girls were everywhere. On the mantelpiece, on the side tables, on the walls. Lily with her gap-toothed grin, Anna clutching her little plastic horse. A shrine to a life that had been stolen. He told her the story, starting with Beth's confession. He spoke gently, leaving out the most horrific details but giving her the truth she had waited a lifetime to hear. He told her about the bunker, the hidden room under the tower. He told her they had found them. He told her they were together. Eleanor listened without a word, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She didn't cry. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of control she had perfected over thousands of days of not knowing. It was as if she were absorbing the information, fitting it into the empty space that had lived inside her for so long. The news was not a shock, it was a confirmation. A confirmation of the nightmare she had never woken up from. When he was finished, she was silent for a long time. The only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall, marking time that no longer mattered. Finally, she looked at him, her voice steady. "Can I see them?" she asked. Reyes explained that the remains were with the medical examiner, that it would be some time before they could be released. It was a sterile, procedural answer, and it felt woefully inadequate. He remembered the locket. He pulled the evidence bag from his pocket and carefully handed it to her. "We found this with them," he said softly. She took the small silver heart, its surface dull and black with age. She held it in the palm of her hand, staring at it. Then, with a thumbnail, she pried open the delicate clasp. It sprang open, revealing the empty space inside. And that's when she finally broke. It wasn't a loud, wailing cry. It was a quiet, broken sound. A single sob that seemed to carry the weight of 31 years of pain. Her shoulders shook, and she hunched over the locket as if to protect it. "I gave this to Lily," she whispered through her tears. "For her 8th birthday. There was a picture inside. A picture of the two of them." The loss of that tiny, faded photograph seemed, in that moment, as tragic as everything else. It was the final, missing piece of her daughter's lives. She composed herself after a few minutes, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The fragile control was back, but her eyes were different now. The resignation was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. She looked directly at Reyes. "The tower," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Did you search the tower itself?" "The structure, not just the hole in the ground." Reyes was taken aback. "We gave it a cursory look," he admitted. "It's derelict, unsafe. We focused on the bunker." Eleanor shook her head. "Lily loved to climb," she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "She was fearless. Always climbing trees, fences, anything she could get her hands on. If they were there, and they were scared, Lily would have gone up. To get a better view. To look for a way out." The thought hit Reyes with the force of a physical blow. They had been so focused on the tomb below, they had completely overlooked the monument above. They had assumed the story ended in that dark, concrete box. But what if there was more? What if there was one last piece of the puzzle, waiting in the rusted skeleton of the tower? Reyes drove back out to the desert the next morning. He went alone. This felt like a pilgrimage now, a final act he had to see through himself. The sun was rising, casting long, dark shadows across the sand. The tower stood silhouetted against the pale pink sky, looking less like a structure and more like a scar on the landscape. He parked the truck and walked to its base, the silence even more profound in the cool morning air. He stepped through the broken fence and into the small concrete building at the tower's base. Inside, a rickety steel staircase led up into the guts of the structure. It was rusted and missing steps in places, and he knew it was foolish to climb it. But Eleanor's words echoed in his head. Lily would have gone up. He started to climb, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The stairs groaned and creaked in protest. Dust, thick as velvet, rained down from above. Shafts of morning light cut through holes in the rusted metal walls, illuminating swirling motes of dust in the still air. It felt like climbing into the belly of some long-dead beast. About halfway up, maybe 50 feet from the ground, he came to a small landing, a platform where equipment might have once been mounted. He stopped to catch his breath, his hand resting on a corroded railing. His eyes scanned the dusty floor of the platform, and in a far corner, tucked away against a steel beam as if placed there for safekeeping, he saw it, a small, square piece of weathered cardboard. He walked over and knelt down, his heart pounding. He picked it up gently. It was a photograph, faded and curled at the edges from decades of heat and cold. The image was ghost-like, but still visible. 2 little girls, one with a gap-toothed smile, the other with serious eyes, standing on either side of their mother. The 3 of them were squinting in the sun, happy. It was the picture from the locket. Lily must have dropped it here. Maybe she had come up here, scared and alone, clutching the one thing that reminded her of her mother, of safety. But that wasn't all. Tucked behind the photograph, pressed between it and the dusty floor, was another piece of paper. It was folded into a small square. Reyes' fingers trembled as he unfolded it. It was an official government form, brittle and yellowed, but the print was still legible. It was a copy of a military discharge certificate. At the top of the form was the name Sergeant Thomas Miller, his service number, his signature. Reyes' breath caught in his throat. He scanned down the page to the section marked Reason for Discharge. The official, typed reason was there. Unauthorized use and modification of sensitive communications equipment. But beside it, in the margin, was a handwritten note. It was penned in faded blue ink, signed by Miller's commanding officer, a personal addendum, an unofficial warning that had been filed away with the paperwork and forgotten for 31 years. The note was just 2 sentences long. Subject exhibits delusional tendencies and a nascent savior complex, the officer had written. He speaks of collecting voices to keep them safe from the world. In my opinion, he is a danger to himself and, potentially, to others. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Miller wasn't just a sadist. He was profoundly, dangerously ill. He didn't see himself as a monster. In his twisted mind, he was a savior. He wasn't just killing his victims. He believed he was collecting them, preserving them, keeping their voices and their lives safe in the dark silence of his bunker. The locket, the plastic horse, he had kept them as trophies, as parts of his collection. Lily and Anna weren't just murdered. They were curated. Reyes stood up, the discharge paper shaking in his hand. He looked out through a hole in the rusted wall, over the vast, silent expanse of the desert. Miller was never found. He could have died out here himself, a victim of the same wilderness where he'd hidden his crimes. Or he could have moved on, another town, another name, another life. Still out there, listening, still collecting. There would be no trial, no prison sentence. There was no final, satisfying justice. There was only this, the quiet, ugly truth, discovered in a dusty, forgotten tower. He carefully folded the paper and the photograph and put them in his pocket. He would take them back to Eleanor Harper. It wasn't the closure she deserved, but it was closure all the same. It was the end of the story, a story of a man who stole voices, and the 2 little girls who were lost in the silence he left behind. Have you ever heard of a case where someone's trust was used against them in such a chilling way? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.